The story of Esther is a magnificent story of God's preservation of his people, and yet, as has often been commented, it doesn't mention prayer and it doesn't mention God. But we see the hand of God in what has happened, because the Jews were delivered, and the Jews were and are the people of God. After Esther revealed Haman's plan and the king had Haman executed, Mordecai increased in importance. So at the end of chapter 8 we read, "So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honour. And in every province and city where the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because the fear of the Jews fell upon them." Haman's plan had been revealed, Haman had been executed, and Mordecai had drafted a second law, which in effect countermanded the first one. The first one said that the enemies of the Jews on a particular day could attack the Jews, kill them, and take their possessions. But the countermanding law said that on that day the Jews may gather together, may defend themselves, resist their enemies, and kill those who come against them. And when people saw that the king's favour was on Mordecai the Jew, we read, not only were the Jews happy, but many of the people of the land became Jews, because the fear of the Jews fell upon them. The story continues. "Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also Parshadatha, Delphon, Ashpartha, Poratha, Adaliah, Aradatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaishazatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed. But they did not lay hand on the plunder. On that day the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. Now the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men in Shushan. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies. but they did not lay hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the month they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who dwelt in Shushan assembled together on the 13th day as well as the 14th day, and on the 15th day of the month they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share together from Esther chapter 9. The original decree that Haman drafted authorised the enemies of the Jews to kill the Jews and take the plunder. But the Jewish people chose not to plunder their enemies. They were not doing this because they wanted their property. They were doing this to vindicate their name, that they were hated for no good reason, and that people needed to know that while people spoke evil of them, there was in fact no justification for that charge. And it reminds us, Haman, the Agagite, reminds us of King Agag, the Amalekite, who Saul was sent to kill, and he was told his soldiers should not take the plunder from the Amalekites, but they did take the plunder. And the Lord from that day ceased to support Saul with his spirit. Here the enemies of the Jews were not plundered, although they were permitted to by the decree that was issued. It all happened on one day. The enemies of the Jews had identified themselves early on. When the first decree went out, over 2 months, they would have started taunting the Jews and saying, "Your day is coming." They had identified themselves, and then when the tables are turned, the Jews knew who their enemies were. And there were many enemies dispersed throughout the kingdom. But it is also evident that the identification of enemies was carried out in a rigorous way. For we read, all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. The king obviously sees that righteousness is a much better policy than hatred, and Mordecai himself becomes the inspiration for many people, because Mordecai, while honouring the king, withstood the king's evil command in such a way that the king comes to accept Mordecai as ultimately the greatest person in the kingdom after the king. And the king was pleased at what had happened, because when you have what today we would call racial hatred in the society, and there is much racial hatred still directed towards the Jews among the nations, the United Nations has sanctioned the Jewish people many more times than any other nation, and yet the Jewish people are arguably the most righteous of the nations. This hatred of the Jew persists today, but when the Lord Jesus comes, he is the Jew who will rule the world. And Isaiah tells us that the nations of the world will come up to Jerusalem to learn the ways of God. But this can only happen when the enemies of the Jews are removed. That day is surely coming. So the king grants the Jews in Shushan a second day to attack their enemies. Those who had secreted themselves on the first day and couldn't be found came out of hiding, thinking that the trouble was over. They had escaped. But in Shushan they were found the second day, and they did not escape. We hate to hear of killing, but when one nation rises against another, the scriptures make it plain that a nation may defend itself and destroy its enemies, which is what is happening here.